tutor all 3 sciences and maths. So
So
I'm really passionate about the science.
you have now an entirely edible garden.
Almost. There's
Almost.
two plants that aren't, well, there's the grass, which we can't eat, but there's also 2 more plants. One is a jasmine, and it smells beautiful. And one is an honesty plant, which I grow because it has those really fun seed pods, so the transparent kind of bits on it. So we do try and grow all edible flowers, but we just do have 2 flowers that are just kind of interesting and fun in different ways.
Do you see those as weeds?
A lot of plants that people consider to be weeds are actually edible. Things like, 3-corner garlic, which is highly invasive. And I think it's actually illegal to plant it in a kind of natural area. So you can plant it in your garden, but you can't transfer the bulbs out into public. You eat the leaves, you can eat the bulbs, eat the flowers, eat the seed pods, but they're called 3-corner garlic because if you cut a stem of a leaf or the flower shoots across in a cross section, you can see a very definite triangle. Their seeds are dispersed by ants. And so, there's ants everywhere. And I think it was Green Park I was in at one point where I was like, I can smell garlic, and you could see swathes of it. It looks a lot like grass. You have to be a bit careful if you forage it because the leaves look a lot like daffodil leaves, the same shape as daffodil leaves-ish, and say about the same size, but daffodil leaves are slightly blue, or they can be quite similar looking to bluebell leaves,
Right.
which daffodil bluebell is poisonous to eat.
So there's another thing which is classed as a weed, and I think it's called Jack by the Hedge.
Yes, a garlicky mustard thing.
Yeah, and it's a kind of heart-shaped leaf, and it just pops up everywhere. And I see it all through London, sort of grow, but bursting out the pavements. And I only sort of a year or so discovered that it was a really tasty, tasty green. And you can just fry it, you can put it in salad, or you can whiz it up into a pesto. It's amazing. So, do you go out foraging then?
Just after lockdown had, the very beginning, there was full lockdown, and people were told not to leave at all. And then we're told you can go out to exercise. We started taking walks for exercise. And at that time, the place was just full of elderflowers, made cordial, made fritters. Because with elderflowers in trees, it's higher than sneezing level, and it's higher than dog weeing level, or even human urinating level. That's something you do have to be careful of in London. We don't tend to forage things that are low, but blackberries occasionally. There's a mulberry bush in a local park that we're really excited about.
Where the exact location is, because one thing I know about foraging is all about the sort of element of surprise when you find things. And I know there are some bloggers and people on Instagram that sort of pin their posts for where you can find particular plants, but I think it's really about encouraging people to go out and explore their sort of local environments. Would you say it's maybe slightly risky to pick things if they were lower down, like blackberries, or because we're very much in blackberry season now, aren't we?
Outdoors is much safer because UV light does break down the virus, but it's not going to be instant. It takes, I know, it depends who you talk to. I think it's somewhere between 10 minutes to an hour. If it's in full sun, it should be fine.
Is washing it in water enough?
The first 2 months of lockdown, when we bought shopping, we would take all the dried goods to quarantine in a kind of cupboard somewhere for days. And then all of the fresh and frozen things I wiped down with a antibacterial wipe, which actually, in hindsight, probably didn't do anything because it's antibacterial. It needs to be antiviral wipe. Yeah, it's kind of peace of mind, I think.
And being mindful with gardening, do you find that that's helped you by sort of having garden tasks to get through this difficult period?
Yeah, definitely. There was a little bit at the beginning where I kind of went into a state of, there's nothing in the shops, we must grow everything. And so every single little crevice of the garden became full of food. Every single little spot got any of our kind of our mushrooms that we bought in the shop in those little tubs became places to grow pea shoots, and we started growing bean sprouts more, and every little nook and cranny. But now I'm a little bit more chilled. I'm like, I don't have to grow carrots, we can buy carrots. And but having a garden, we're really lucky. We were very aware that we are really lucky that we have an outside space, because there's lots of people in London who don't have outside space.
You've just signed up to Lend and Tend recently,
Yes.
so thank you. I'm really excited to see who you match up with in the future. But for people that are just starting, potentially somebody that might have a lawn and like a seating area, might only want to share maybe the side strip or a small portion of the garden. If somebody wanted to start growing food themselves and wanted to use a small patch and make that thrive, what are going to be the things that they should try growing to get the most use out of a small area?
I'd say grow vertically, because there's all this space above that you could, grow things up. A plant I love is called tromboncino. I think that's how you pronounce it. Tromboncino. You get these courgette-like fruits. So they taste like courgette, but they can grow kind of this long, but they vine. So your courgette tends to be quite bushy, but this vines and it will grow up and over. And I can actually show you. It loops over the back of the fence, and then this is a shared space with the neighbour, but nobody uses it because it used to be garages here. So I loop it back over, and then it comes back over the fence, and then I just keep it going. So it grows vines of 20 odd feet if you let it, and all along the vine you'll get tromboncino fruit, which hang quite big, and so you get more for that space.
I noticed there something that looks like a kale.
Yeah, so this here, the very, very tall thing is a purple tree collard.
Oh my goodness.
It's perennial, it's winter hardy, so and most kales are anyway.
So did you just propagate it by cutting a bit off?
You just cut a bit off, stick it in the soil. So a lot of them, they don't always propagate, but when they do, you basically get a new.
Do you put water first, or do you just put it straight into damp soil?
Straight into damp soil. I'm not a horticulturist, and things like that are great. It does bush out a bit, but you can train it to be a tree, so that's also something you can put in a small space. Going back to tall plants that provide lots of things for the small footprint, things like beans are great. Nasturtiums are really good because you can get a lot of nasturtiums are bushy, but you can get a trailing variety. Mm-hmm. You can train, and then you can eat everything. You can eat the flowers, you can eat the leaves. They're very spicy when you have them raw. When you cook them, they're like stir fried. They're amazing.
Yeah.
We have vining spinaches. Oh, that's another one for small spaces. There's a Malabar spinach, which is a vining spinach. If you have a shady area, there's something called Caucasian spinach, and that's right here. It's right here in my shadiest corner. So this corner here gets no sun whatsoever. And that's why I've got my mushroom logs there. That's something I'm trying this year. I don't know if it's going to work, but I'll keep you posted. But this big bush here, that is a Caucasian spinach. It's called Caucasian spinach because it's from the Caucasus region, so kind of Scandinavia. It's very very cold, and the winters are very cold up there. But it's a spinach that you can eat just like spinach. It's great cooked. And they've got these tiny little flowers, and they're edible too, but it produces a lot of seed.
That's incredible. But so that's totally shaded there.
But this bit here never gets sun. The top bit here might get a little bit of sun.
Yes.
Kind of 4 or 5 o'clock. But actually, this whole bit here, this corner here, will never see the sun ever. It's the shadiest
so useful to know, because so many people ask me what edibles can I grow in a really shady patio garden, or a small shaded garden. And obviously in London, where buildings are tall and we're all sort of on top of each other and looking overlooked, that's a really handy tip to know.
So again, the vertical plants are great because if they can grow towards sun, then sometimes they don't. If you have a fence where the sun comes from this side, if you can get it to grow towards the sun, then by the time it needs to be productive, generally it has what it needs to grow.
I'm looking at this beautiful arch of, are they blackberries behind you?
Yes. So this is a full nursery. So it starts down here somewhere, and it does grow ridiculously big. So we've made this arch out of kind of reclaimed materials. We had solar panels put on the roof, and they had these rails left over that they kind of left in our house. And I don't know if you can see them. There's kind of a metal frame there.
Sort of obscure, but yeah.
Yeah. We've cobbled it together and kind of lashed it together mostly in the middle. But we've made this arch and then just let these blackberries climb over. I'm a big fan of using kind of what you have.
And it looks really enchanting with this lovely fruiting archway behind you. You are also a gardening teacher.
Out at my little one's school, I kind of sent the headmaster my blog and was like, look, I'm really passionate. This is the kind of things I could do. And they gave me the job. And so once a week before lockdown happened, I was going in and taking all the different year groups, just a few kids, kind of anywhere between 4 and 8 kids at a time, and just doing some gardening with them, doing some planting, doing some seed sowing, we made trellises out of the leftover prunings from the apple trees.
Whilst the children are growing and going up each year, they sort of participate in this change and seeing how things develop and seeing how things grow. And I think that's another thing about, particularly as adults who are new to gardening, a lot of people expect results quite quickly, and from the beginning of the season to have completely like a fruitful garden by the end of the season. But I think something that's really important to teach children is the art of patience, and it's something they really get. They get that things take time. Yeah. There is a GCSE in gardening now. I mean, I would have loved to have done that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What's the youngest do you think you can start teaching your child to start gardening?
So my little one knows lots about flowers and vegetables and fruit, because since she turned 2 and I let her free in the garden, I've just taught her kind of what she can and can't eat. And that's part of the reason why nothing in my garden is it's all edible or non-toxic, at least, because I wasn't really worried about her toddling around as a 2-year-old putting things in her mouth. And so when we moved in, the garden was flagstones all the way to the end. And so this is what 3 years worth of growing looks like.
What an achievement to take all those flagstones up and return the garden to a more natural, biodiverse state. And your daughter was 2 then, and I saw her earlier, and she was naming plants, she was picking marshmallow flowers, eating them.
So basically by this time 3 years ago, I'd laid the lawn. So all these things in the garden you can do yourself. Like, if you want to, you can pay professionals to do it, but if you have the patience, you can do everything, and you can do it all really, really cheap. Like, I think the biggest expense was buying things like an apple tree and a pear tree, because you can't get cuttings for those. They need to be grafted, and that's something I haven't tried yet, but maybe one day.
A lot, though.
Yeah, and if you have the patience, you can, rather than buy a big blueberry bush, you can buy a little tiny blueberry. So you can get some palm shop, you can get little blueberry cuttings. Just be a little bit wary. So look at the variety that they're trying to sell you. Sometimes the variety could be something that, if they say tart, it does mean sour. So if it says, a beautiful raspberry that with a tart, refreshing taste, it's a sour raspberry. Don't be fooled. But if you look at the variety they're selling and it says it's a sweet, flavorful, whatever, has a long season, then go ahead and buy it. In the autumn, kind of winter time, buy bare root bushes and fruit trees, and they're much cheaper again. It didn't cost much at all to do the garden, because we did everything and did the work ourselves. But you just have to be patient. And going back to what you said before about patience, I think adults get very easily put off when when their plants fail. Like this month, so many of my things have died from just slug. And I think and I lost a melon and a wineberry, and I'm like, I don't even know why it died. I don't have a clue. But that's, and I've had some powdery mildew, but that's all part of it. One of the hardest places to garden sometimes is a very, very sunny spot, because if there's no shade at all, that ground, especially in London, bakes hard.
Right.
I find it really hard to keep it, because once it bakes hard, no amount of watering is going to help you, because it just runs off. A slightly shady area sometimes better than a full full sun area.
Yeah, and that, when you say about the very sunny gardens being just as bad as a very shady garden, one of the things that I'm learning more about, particularly from people like Charles Dowding, is about building up those organic layers so the little creatures to sort of start chomping their way and breaking up all of that really hard earth.
I saw the interview. He's talking about fungal mycelium, which is for fungi, which is naturally present in the ground, and you can buy it in little packets and sprinkle it into the roots of things that you're planting, because that has a symbiotic relationship where it can help this plant find more nutrients, because it's kind of like hairs going everywhere and accessing everything.
Because the fungus is what they call the like the internet of plants, isn't it?
There is supposed to be something about how it can provide information on where better nutrients are and things like that, because it is everywhere. But it helps the plant absorb water and things like that and make the most of the area it's in. So the biggest problem we have with kind of agriculture in kind of factory style agriculture, where you have fields of wheat and fields of corn and things like that, is there's not enough biodiversity. And so if you have like a field of potatoes, it's taking the same nutrients out, the same kind of minerals and the needs out of the soil that this one plant has, which is why crop rotation is really important. But actually, rather than growing one massive crop, if you grow lots of things together, they take different things from the soil, and so your soil retains its quality for longer. Composting, as you said, and that's again, it's a great thing because it's free. You're providing nutrients to the soil. On my blog, I've done this this post about fertilizers, but actually they're not that great for the soil.
Yes.
Like I do sometimes use a bit of fertilizer on, in pots and things like that, because I don't have enough compost, I did in my house to provide all the needs for the garden, especially after I've gone crazy with the COVID-19 grow everything. But yeah, fertilizers are really, this is the science teacher in me. So
please, I'm loving it.
GCSE chemistry, every single syllabus, you do different exam boards, but all of them cover something called the Haber process.
The Haber process.
Haber process. So this is a process that you learn about in GCSE about making ammonia. So it's really interesting because I've read that Haber, the guy who invented the process, actually he invented it as part of chemical warfare. It was a poisonous gas. So ammonia it's a basic gas. So if you mix it with water, it becomes alkali. So breathing in ammonia gas means that you get alkali in your lungs, which is really bad. Bad. Don't breathe ammonia, kids. So the guy who invented it wasn't great, but then fertilizers now are so important to the world because of our population. We have such a big population that without fertilizers, it wouldn't be possible to produce enough food to feed the population. But then your inorganic fertilizers, they are really soluble. So they then they leach out of your soil into ponds where they cause pond death because it gets the algae to grow on the surface. This is a biology topic, eutrophication, where fertilizers in the soil cause algae on the top to bloom. And so you get ponds that are just covered with algae. That blocks out the sun. So the pond weed underneath, all the pond plants can't survive.
They're not choking.
Yeah, they don't produce oxygen anymore because they need the sun to produce oxygen. They need the sun to photosynthesize, to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and sugars. And so you're left with fish that have no oxygen to breathe. You've got plants that can't photosynthesize, and eventually, when there's no more oxygen, they can't survive either. And you get just dead ponds because of fertilizers. And then the process of creating those fertilizers requires a very large amount of energy to do so, because it's like 400 degrees C and really high pressure. I think it's 200 atmospheres pressure. So to maintain that temperature and that pressure, it's a lot of energy. Then the raw materials to make ammonia are nitrogen and hydrogen. So and nitrogen comes out of the air, it's distilled out of the air, condensed out of the air. But that again requires energy. And then the hydrogen generally comes from natural gas. So again, a fossil fuel. So your fertilizers, the process of making them isn't great. Then you have to store them, you have to transport them, that's a carbon footprint. And then if you use them, they can go into, ponds and things like that, and cause death. So, where you can, if you can recycle your food waste, so rather than have somebody, take your food waste away and put it into landfill, or even, this borough will recycle food waste, which is great, but still there is a carbon footprint involved with trucking that food waste somewhere and processing it. I'm a big advocate of something called hole composting, which is literally you dig a hole, put your peelings into it, cover it, and then literally that will break down much, much quicker than putting it into a composter, because it's got access to the worms and everything.
And they just go straight through it, don't they? This thing that you're talking about with, the carbon footprint involved in fertilizers, as well as the terrible use of pesticides in commercial industrial food growth. There's a really great documentary. A 6-year-old food activist has been campaigning for and to stop using ingredients with fertilizers in the Brownie Group of America cookies that they sell to raise money, and she actually was successful in her campaign.
Amazing.
You can be a food activist as young as your daughter, who's now 4. This little girl started at 6. And yes, but the scary thing about this documentary called The Need to Grow, which is really really informative, and I think it's free to watch online. I'll put a link in. There is apparently, unless we start doing something about it now, there is only 60 years left of usable soil left on the planet, because of the way that we're industrially farming, and we're basically going to kill all of the farmable land. And there's been this self-sustaining crisis recently, with everybody, rushing to panic buy in the shops and then not having enough fresh food available. And it's amazing that your garden is just proof that in as little as 2-3 years, you've got virtually an entirely edible garden, which you are, also joining Lend and Tend to start garden sharing as well. And it's amazing proof that, teaching young children that they can grow, small children that are engaged in the environment and growing, they grow up to be adults that care about the environment. There's something, I was part of the National Park City 100 Voices chat. It's so brilliant. It's available on YouTube, where you can watch all of these really inspirational people who've got little projects all over London. And I definitely think that you should join in when they next do an event, Jessi, because they would love to hear about you. And I'll definitely tag them into your work and your project. But a scary fact that I heard is that young people, they spend less time outside than people that are incarcerated. Not everyone's lucky enough to have a gardening class at their school, but how would you say to other parents to start really just taking small steps and getting their kids interested in putting down the iPad or coming away from the TV and going out in all weathers?
It's really hard. There are limitations. There are, sometimes no garden. It is unfortunate that the responsibility, but the task to get our kids outside does lie heavily with schools. Because, if your school has a good gardening project, then that'll set your kids up for life, because getting them interested at a young age with somebody who's passionate about it, help. And as a parent, it's really hard to stay engaged with your kids sometimes, especially when you have jobs to do. You've got,
Sure.
dishes to do, bills to pay, admin to do. There's always admin things to sort. Fund your school, encourage them, donate plants to them, anything you can to help them get started. I tend to grow a lot of things in the garden that I wanted to eat, because she won't eat. There were a lot of things that she wouldn't even touch if they came out of the fridge. Once they came out of the garden, she was a lot more interested in them, and she ate a lot more. And there's a lot more that she eats now because we've grown it. But the other thing to mention is food generally does taste much better when you grow it yourself. And it's not just a psychological thing, because it's in season, it tastes better, but also things like blueberries and raspberries, they do not travel well or store well when they're ripe. And so they're picked at the farm before they're ripe, just slightly underripe, so they can be taken to a supermarket, and then they don't taste good. Whereas when you pick it off your own bush, you wait till it's perfectly ripe and you pick it straight away, and it's beautiful. And even that whole thing of food that's been in the fridge, when it's cold, there's not as, so your nose is a really important thing in taste. When things are colder, they don't have as much aroma. And so as you eat them, they don't taste as good out of the fridge as they do warm off
Oh,
fresh.
going back to talking about fertilizers and particularly industrial fertilizing, I'm trying to grow sweet corn, not so successfully. My
Oh, me
sweet corn
too. That's
are
rubbish.
budding. They've got flowers on them and they're only about a foot high, whereas a neighbour of mine is also growing sweet corn, but they're enormous. They're 6 feet.
Same variety though?
Well, I don't know about the variety, but he told me that he's using a certain branded fertilizer with ammonia in it. And I mean, I'm trying to grow as organically as possible.
So ammonia is the base of all fertilizers, all commercial fertilizers. And that's why the Haber process is so important and why it's taught in GCSE. Because without the ammonia, you can't make fertilizers, because that's how they get the nitrogen. So the air that we breathe even is 79% generally nitrogen, but can't utilize that. Plants can't utilize that. They can only utilize it in the form of nitrates, which are derived from ammonia, which is NH3. So all your fertilizers will contain nitrogen, but nitrates, nitrogen derived from ammonia, derived from nitrogen, is required for all plant growth. And so there are different needs within a plant. So most fertilizers will have, they call it NPK. They're required for different parts of plant growth. So all living beings require nitrogen in some form, because that's how you build proteins. You build it from amino acids, which are built from which require nitrogen. So things like the plant hormones, which control their growth and their, the rate of their ripening and all that, do require nitrogen. So hormones are basically proteins that do a function. But it just means, just because something does grow big, it doesn't mean, like my fig tree back there is huge, but, doesn't mean it's got figs. Well, it's got figs on it, but doesn't mean they're going to ripen. That's just the curse of the British weather. Figs don't do great in this country because they need a long season, a good season to grow and ripen. But yeah, as you say, just because it looks good, it doesn't mean, it is good. Like, all your kind of worm-eaten, if your leaves, your lettuce leaves are all kind of chewed to bits by slugs, it means they're tasty. It means that something really wants to eat them. But it doesn't look good on the plate. So it's, pesticides can make your plants look good.
Yeah.
But, it doesn't mean anything in terms of how good it tastes, or the plant, or how healthy the plant is, really. If you ever grow asparagus, it will never ever taste anything like shop-bought asparagus. It's definitely worth just having a little patch to just grow some asparagus. It's one of the vegetables that are available really early on, and it's perennial, so you don't have to do anything with it. It keeps growing year after year. But we've grown it 9 years now, because the first time we ate it, we couldn't believe how different it tastes. And it's because once you cut the asparagus, it starts converting the sugars into carbohydrates, so going backwards. And even, proper asparagus aficionados will put the water to boil or put the oven on to roast it or grill it before they go and pick it. So they literally pick it and cook it straight away. If you think of shop-bought asparagus, it's been from the farm to the shop, being sitting in the shop for a while, sitting in your freezer for a while, in the fridge for a while. It just means that it loses so much of the sweetness and so much of the flavour just from being stored. So yeah, that's another thing about kind of growing your own, is things taste better for, not just because of ripeness, but because of freshness too. I think when you garden and you grow your own, you get this whole new respect for the food that you eat. Yeah. And you eat the things that don't look so good as well, because you're like, I've grown this, I've put all this effort and all this time into growing it. I don't care how it looks, I'm going to eat it. You cut out that little, the little kind of slug eating bit or the caterpillar eating bit, and you eat it anyway, which you wouldn't do so much with a shop bought thing, and you don't see the value in it as much. Whereas when you grow it, you've put your own sweat, blood and tears into it. You are more likely to eat more of it, and it's a really good lesson for our kids to learn as well. They're more likely to eat more of they have if they grow their own as well.